You've heard the film music of John Williams. Let's talk about what makes it so good. And hello, welcome to the Musician Toolkit, Episode 8. I'm your host, David Lane. It is great to be with you once again. And I'm really excited about today's episode because we are talking about maybe the most influential composer in terms of who inspired me to become a professional musician. And that is the film composer John Williams. If by some miracle you don't know who John Williams is and you're listening to a podcast about musicianship, we could be here quite a while I just list off some of the numerous credits where you might have heard him before, from his television days where he did the music for Gilligan's Island and Lost in Space, among many others, to the numerous comedies that he did throughout the 60s. But really we're talking about his heydays where he became really well known through movies such as Jaws, Superman, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Raiders of the Lost Ark, and the Indiana Jones movies that followed, E.T., the Extra Terrestrial, of course, the Star Wars, all of the episode named the mainstream Star Wars, and then, of course, Harry Potter, the first two films, and it just goes on and on. He has a storied collaboration with Steven Spielberg, and we're going to talk about some of the things that made him a great musician. It might help you understand. I think when you listen to this conversation that I'm going to have, it's kind of to my point. It's not just that John Williams decided he was going to be a great composer and studied all that he could about composing. He actually started his professional career doing something else. And the experiences that he gained through exploring different sides of music and to listening to different kinds of music all went into what makes him the legendary composer that he is. And the reason we're coming out with this week is it's just a few days past his 91st birthday when this episode comes out. Before I tell you about our guest today and just a few other things, I want to encourage you to let me know, what is your favorite John Williams score? That's my question to you. And you can, of course, send me a message. You can DM me or go to my website, davidlanemusic.com and /contact, and leave a message. Or if you would like for me to present that as a portion of a future podcast episode, you don't mind leaving a voicemail, you can go to speakpipe.com /musiciantoolkit. Leave me a voicemail. What is your favorite John Williams score, and maybe why? If there's a certain theme, if there's a certain scene in the that you enjoy, and if you have more than one, you can even give me a top 2, top 3, top 5. What John Williams film score is your favorite? So please participate. Go to speakpipe.com /musiciantoolkit. Also, if you check out in the show notes, as usual, just want to remind you, if you have a studio of any kind where it involves scheduling and receiving payment, you really should check out the trial that you could get through Fonz, and you might find that you've been missing out on having a more streamlined experience. This next thing that I'm going to say, you are only hearing it if you were watching this on YouTube, and that is that the podcast version of this episode, so if you go to the podcast stream, will include some music clips to accompany what we're talking about. So if you want to hear the music as we talk about it, you actually need to go to a podcast episode. So it's kind of opposite of last week. Last week I told you that it was better to come to YouTube so you could see all of the visual diagrams and so forth. But in this case, I'm probably going to send you to the podcast if you want the full experience. I appreciate YouTube, but their copyright police can be intense even when it comes to things covered by the Fair Use Act. I don't want to tempt that right now. So there would be no music clips. If you're watching on YouTube, we are just going to discuss the music. But go check it out on the podcast if you want the full experience. My guest today is the Associate Professor Dr. Frank Lehman from Tufts University. His qualifications to speak with me about the music of John Williams are quite impressive. if you go to his website at franklehman.com and just look around, where he teaches at Tufts University in Massachusetts, you will see a lot of peer-reviewed uh, articles that he has had on film music, and namely John Williams. And I just wanted to list off just a very few. He has an internet publication called A Guide to the Musical Themes of Indiana Jones. He has there's a book chapter from Sounds Like Action, Music in Action called John Williams Action Music in the 21st Century. In the Washington Post in 2019, he published an article called How John Williams' Star Wars Score Pulls Us to the Dark Side. And one really impressive article that I'll mention, and I'll mention it again at the end, is he has an ongoing catalog and commentary on his website called The Themes of Star Wars Catalog and Commentary. It is super comprehensive. It's every melodic idea that appears in any movie, fully analyzed with harmony and also where it occurs and how it's used. And if you are a Star Wars geek, or John Williams geek, or both, some combination of thereof, and you really want to get into the nitty gritty, go check it out. And as he mentions in this interview, he's about to add a whole lot more to it, and it is just really an impressive tool. I would encourage you to go check that out through his website, again, which I'll put in the show notes. So the plan going into the interview was that we were going to talk about three very different scores, and the first two that we talk about may not be that popular. The first film we discuss is the 1995 film Sabrina, starring Harrison Ford, and we'll talk about kind of the lighter, jazzier influence of John Williams. And then we also talk about Images, which is a very surreal score from 1972, Robert Altman film. And those are probably not as popular as the third film that we were going to talk about, which is Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back. And we will talk a little bit about that, but that has been put off for another episode, and we have already scheduled when we're going to come back together to talk about that. It will happen this year, so it's a bit of a teaser for this episode, what we do talk about for The Empire Strikes Back. But we did get a little bit in, but we're going to dissect it quite a bit more later, and I'm really looking forward to that for reasons that'll become clear, as I say, when we get to that point. But before we talk about some of those scores, to use as an example, we're going to talk about John Williams and, what are some of his influences? What are some of the techniques that he used, and where did he gather the experience that led to those techniques? And I really enjoyed my talk with Frank Lehman, and so now I'm going to present it now. Here's my conversation with Dr. Frank Lehman. My pleasure today to be talking to Dr. Frank Lehman. And do you mind if I call you Frank?
Please, go ahead.
Excellent. I'll give more information in the intro about, what you do, but you're an associate professor at Tufts University. That's in Massachusetts, right?
That's right outside Boston.
And you're a music theorist, and you're also a film musicologist. So maybe just elaborate on that a bit. What is it that you do?
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you, first of all, for having me on. This is, I think this will be fun. Music theorist and film musicologist. Well, a lot of these sort of disciplinary boundaries are a little bit fuzzy to begin with, but the film musicology thing, that is, I am devoted to the academic study of music and cinema, whether it's in big mainstream movies or smaller independent or obscure films, all of it is fascinating and worthy of attention. And, people seem to be interested in it too, not just within the pretty narrow confines of the academy, but students and the public. So then the music theory side of things, that's more, analytical, sort of dealing with the notes on the page, trying to figure out musical structure and
right,
stylistic practices and where things come from, where they're going, musically speaking. It can get very technical, pretty quickly, which is fun for some people, maybe a little bit intimidating for others. But the combination of those two things, I think maybe my preferred approach is, to do a real in-depth investigation of the actual music in film, because it is so interesting and it's so rewarding to study in depth.
Right. Well, it's great to have you on. This is a podcast about musicianship. And as I said when I started, well, sometimes I'm going to highlight certain musicians and look what is it about them that makes them tick. So, I don't think it would be a stretch to say that John Williams is, when you consider all the age groups, probably the most popular film composer
Mm-hmm.
of all time. I know you could probably make an argument for some generations to say Hans Zimmer, who's been a little bit
Right.
more, busy lately. But John Williams, I mean, the way I kind of go about that is like, first of all, he connected with a television audience with, like,
Right.
Gilligan's Island, Lost in Space. And then he became childhood favorites for anybody who had childhoods in the 70s or 80s with, oh, let's just, I mean, I don't know if as a child you were watching Jaws, but
Right.
yeah, Jaws, Star Wars, Superman. I mean, the original trilogy, Star Wars, which we're going to refer to that. E.T., you know, um, the Indiana Jones trilogy. So you had that all throughout the 70s and 80s. And then by some miracle, like over 10 years later, he becomes a household name with a whole new generation of children through the Harry Potter first two films. And he's done several things since then. Of course, Jurassic Park is kind of in between. And so I guess one of the things I'd like for this podcast to go through is, one, why is he so popular? And I mean, besides that, he's had the fortune of getting very popular films, but also, what is it? I think he also, besides being one of the most popular, he's highly regarded as one of the greatest film composers to ever live. I mean, there's very few. You might, in other eras, you might say Korngold, Bernard Herrmann. From a technical standpoint, someone like Alex North. There's Jerry Goldsmith. There's plenty of candidates for that. But I'd like to look in what is the things that makes John Williams tick. So, what do you know about his background? Like what are the things that he did before film music that might have had an influence?
Well, Williams has a very eclectic musical background,
Right.
which is cannot be overstated how essential that was in sort of sculpting his musical personality, and the degree to which he can be like a musical chameleon in his film music, and other musics. So, yeah, I think as a kid he played piano and brass. I want to say trombone, and was involved in bands in the LA scene back when he was in his teens in the 1940s. And then a series of steps took him into both the sort of arranging world and also classical composition, piano, and jazz arranging and composition.
Right.
So long before he actually sort of started scoring pictures, he was a really adept arranger. He arranged for Mahalia Jackson. He did arrangements and performed himself on various jazz records. Was probably known first and foremost during his early years as a really accomplished virtuoso jazz pianist. He also he studied at Juilliard, classical piano, so he has that under his belt as well.
Right.
It wasn't necessarily specifically as a composer that he started his career. It was almost more of a performer / recording artist.
Right.
He was involved in lots of different genres, moving in and out of the scenes in New York and LA. He also had a stint in the Air Force when he was stationed in the Maritime provinces in Canada, and he wrote, I think, his first true film score for a documentary on Newfoundland, sort of tourism short film, which is viewable on YouTube, and it's good. It's cheesy and lo-fi,
Right.
go for these days, but it's still kind of recognizably John Williams.
Right.
So from the very start, he had to sort of cultivate a mastery of a lot of different musical styles and idioms: jazz, gospel, classical, modern classical, and so on. And this, I think, allowed him to get his foot in the door once it came to writing or orchestrating shows, television shows early on in the 1950s, and then smaller pictures, and gradually over the course of the 60s and especially the 70s, those projects just became more and more prominent. And on occasion he could bring in his more popular or jazz oriented background into the style of the films that he he's contributing to. A lot of those early 60 films are like
Yeah.
sex comedies as a sort of travesties and
Right.
things that enabled Williams to go for a more comedic and often more popular or jazz inflected style. We don't see that quite as much in his current output, which is hard to
Right.
believe I'm saying current output. He's 91 years old and
Right.
he's still going strong. But it became, I guess, I don't want to say pigeonholed because
Right.
the thing to celebrate, but he became associated with these big, sweeping orchestral symphonic scores in the 1970s. But he really established himself before that point as being extremely competent when it comes to other musical styles, which are no less challenging or involve no less amount of craft to convincingly pull off.
Right. Right. So, one of the things that John Williams did is he had a connection with Henry Mancini early on.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always thought, especially, Henry Mancini is a lot more eclectic than people realize. He's known for some of the Blake Edwards scores and of course the songs that he wrote for those films like Moon
Mm-hmm.
River, and the Days of Wine and Roses. But he also Henry Mancini had um, he was kind of the guy to go to for your B science fiction movies in the 50s, like Tarantula, what is it? Something Tarantula, Creature from the Black Lagoon. I'm actually, that may not be his, but he did films like that. And I was just wondering, and of course, John Williams first became known to audiences as like the pianist who played, for Peter Gunn, for
Exactly. Yeah.
example. And just curious, in your analysis of John Williams' music and other film music, how much of an influence do you think Henry Mancini had on John Williams early on?
Well, I think it's actually fairly strong. I mean, he Mancini was, as you say, had a very large palette stylistically. Even if we know him best today as a composer of really immortal lyrical songs with a
Right.
jazzy style to them. Yeah, and Williams, of course, knew Mancini and played for him. Williams, there's a surprising number of classic movie soundtracks that involve Williams as the pianist, right? It's not just
Right.
Peter Gunn, but like the West Side Story film musical or To Kill a Mockingbird. That's him on the piano at the beginning. It's really
Wow.
surprising. He would have been, an accomplished contributor to Hollywood history if it were just for those piano solos that he was playing.
Right.
But as
Well,
far as like the specifics go, I think it's probably an aspect of the harmonic vocabulary, certain melodic gestures, this tendency towards lyricism and singability that certainly Mancini perfected. But there's a subtlety there too,
right.
that Williams definitely picks up on. And I would also note people like Alex North and
Right.
the sort of larger move towards a film musical style in the 1950s and 60s that was a little bit less, say, late romantically determined, that you could bring in elements of jazz harmony and popular music that really strongly influenced Williams, I want to say.
And I don't think it can be understated that besides his collaboration with Mancini, he was actually friends, which is when you know about who I'm talking about, it's almost amazing to say that, but he was friends with Bernard Herrmann,
Right. The famously irascible and hard to get along with man. Yeah, but Bernard Herrmann and Williams were, I don't know how close they were, but
Yeah.
Herrmann certainly served as a mentor figure for Williams and, gave him advice, not just on his film music, but also his concert music. And you can hear elements of Herrmann's music for sure, affectionate references and
You can hear a direct quote in the original Star Wars. It's like there's a 3-note motif.
That's right, the psycho motif, yeah, right,
Yeah.
which is like a little in joke that is undeniable when you know it's there, even though it doesn't seem to be particularly motivated by anything happening on the screen. But yeah,
well,
Williams,
it's almost a eulogy, isn't it? Because it was less than a year since Bernard Herrmann had passed away.
yeah, and
Yeah.
yeah, and Williams was the composer for Hitchcock's subsequent the first movie. I want to say post.
Oh yeah,
No,
family.
he asked. I think he got permission from Herman. So for
Right.
family plot, yeah, he didn't want to, because Herman and Hitchcock had their falling out at that point. And Williams didn't want to alienate
Right.
his sort of.
In my opinion, I think Bernard Herrmann changed film music just about as much as anybody. I mean, Alex North was, the first person to really get the jazz element into it,
Mhm.
but if you compare to like the 40s and 50s scores of Bernard Herrmann to everybody else, it just
Yeah.
seems like he was just on his own planet.
Right, right.
And
It really comes across, and not just in those films where the extraplanetary quality is
right,
obvious, like the science fiction type films, but Herman's influence. I mean, it's hard to say just one thing as an
right.
orchestrator. It's tremendously distinctive and hard to imitate
Yeah.
successfully. But
There are some classical composers that when I listen to, I'm like, I've never been able to ask John Williams if these are favorites, but I hear a lot of Samuel Barber's work,
Mhm,
like Overture to the School of Scandal.
yeah,
There's a he did one called like the Commando March, which is kind of a more obscure piece, but it's like the way that opens. It's
mm,
got a little triplet figure in the brass. It sounds like it came right out of Star Wars. And of course, we
yeah,
know Prokofiev and Stravinsky, and
yep,
he's mentioned. I thought I heard him say one time he has a collection of Beethoven string quartets by his bedside that he
yeah.
reads at night as kind of like his bedtime reading.
Yep, yep. Williams has a frankly frightening knowledge of the classical art music canon.
Right.
Haydn is probably his favorite single composer. He
Oh
says that
wow, I didn't know
recently.
that.
Yeah, with Barber, for sure, the violin concerto in particular seems to have been on his mind when writing the score to Born on the Fourth of July. All the sort of mid-century American composers of instrumental symphonic music were well
Okay.
known to Williams, Copeland and Harris, and
Well, out of respect for your time, let's continue talking about his influences, but let's be a little bit more
sure,
specific. So,
sure,
we talked in advance, and there's so many films that we could choose to talk about, but we thought three ones that are very different would be good. So, the first one I thought we'd talk about is Sabrina, and you can maybe add to this list, but I thought as I was listening to this is the type of score that I would say you'd find throughout the '60s. I mean, just kind of look at his '60s filmography, and I'm not
hmm
even really going to name any of those.
yeah, right.
Well, I should say not the westerns, but the
Oh yeah,
comedies.
yeah. We should give homage to the westerns, which are really
Yes,
excellent too.
but I thought Sabrina's very similar to a couple of underrated scores from the '80s, Stanley and Iris, The
Mhm.
Accidental Tourist, and of course I also noticed. I'd say later on, Catch Me If You Can is kind of in
Mhm.
that vein. But I was just listening to it again this morning. There's a lot of similarity to Home Alone. I think if you add
Yeah.
more Celesta and a little
Mhm.
more
You're right.
Tchaikovsky homage, you're getting Home Alone with the
Yeah.
sound you have in Sabrina.
Right. It's an interesting kind of hybrid score. It is a romantic comedy, and he dials up the romance with the sort of sentimental throwback kind of themes and orchestrations throughout. It's very piano heavy score, but it's also a comedy. It's fairly light throughout, and he is sort of conjuring in some places a similar sound world to Home Alone and some other lighter movies. It's a small scale score, although the orchestration at times is quite lush. It's not strictly speaking a chamber score, even if the
Right.
most characteristic parts of it are piano solos or piano plus a small number of winds and string backing. Yeah,
Yeah.
and it does look forward in some ways to Catch Me If You Can, which is I'd say probably more thoroughly jazz oriented and a little
Right.
improvisatory in some of its qualities. Sabrina is like a comfort food of a score. It's very
Yeah.
accessible and melodious and has
Yeah.
a bright outlook.
Right. And it's by a director. I believe is that Sidney Pollack.
Hmm.
I mean, a director that was kind of more active, I think, with John Williams in the '60s. But of course, this is the same director did Tootsie and
Yeah, yeah.
some other really light scores, which he'd worked with Dave Grusin, with some of those.
Hmm.
So, yeah, I was just listening. I was really struck by the main theme, which is mostly piano. And by the way, do you happen to know did Williams play that, or did he have session musician play it?
Um, I I doubt that he played the piano on this particular score, although
Hmm.
he has in the past, for
Right.
sure. and it certainly is capable. And there may well be a recording or two of him with the Boston Pops,
Right.
playing it alongside the orchestra, because he's absolutely capable of it. There is a clip somewhere on YouTube. It was from an Evening at Pop's concert where he and Gene Shalit are chatting, and they're in a room with a grand piano, and you see Williams just sort of casually playing, some complicated little piano passage work from the Sabrina theme, as though it were nothing, and then it segues into a big orchestral rendition of the theme.
Right.
I don't think so. But I could be wrong though. He does
Okay.
on occasion, play, but usually he farms that stuff out to
Right.
the pros these days.
Yes. Yes. I think and I haven't heard it yet, and it's because I haven't seen it. The Fablemans.
Mhm.
I am one of those that when possible, I like to see the movie and experience the score in context before I hear it
No,
separately. Sometimes I can't, but
I'm
I'm
I'm the
I hope I
opposite.
can do that. Yeah.
I can't help myself. I
Yeah.
probably know 100 times more scores by just their pure musical
Right.
content than the actual
But
film.
I will say you got to be careful about that.
Yeah,
Just an
right.
example, if don't ever, if you're out there, don't ever, if you've never seen The Sixth Sense, don't go listen to the soundtrack, or if you do, don't look at the track names
Yeah.
before you watch the film because
I
there's a
I
big
would
twist
I
in
would
the
argue that if you're paying attention, you can even sort of put it together just by listening and having
right,
a vague sense from what the music is telling you that something big is being revealed.
right.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I don't know that Sabrina is a kind of twist-oriented
No,
film, but you
uh,
can tell from the soundtrack that it has a happy, romantically satisfying ending, at least.
right. One of the other films I know we're going to talk about is Images, and there is a twist revealed in the tracks names
Yeah,
of that. But back to Sabrina, talking about the piano theme, it's really kind of simply based on three notes, like C down an octave, up a step. And I like how when, this is, I think, John Williams showing off classical and jazz sensitivity here.
mhm,
It's like, I know it's a F major. I don't know if it's to a D minor or B flat. I don't remember, but it's a very
mhm,
simple within the
mhm.
context of the scale. But for the C, C, D, but then he goes back to the F and then goes to an E7,
Right,
which
right.
it's like takes it to A minor for a moment.
But it actually doesn't go to A minor, right?
Right.
very next chord is a minor seven.
Yep.
It's this sort of
Exactly.
flexible harmonic language that it's completely drawn from his jazz expertise, right? There,
Yeah.
even when the harmonic function is conventional, like when he does go to the five chord, it's still
Right.
loaded with extensions and dissonant pitches, things that you wouldn't necessarily expect given the simplicity overall of the melody.
Right.
The accompaniment is also it's fairly elaborate. The It's not just the tune. We're hearing counter lines almost implied by the arpeggiated left hand. And when
Right.
the full orchestra comes in, we get these lovely little call and response elements to the theme. Um, and he does a crucial modulation in some of the versions of the Sabrina theme where it does become minor, and more chromatic and modulatory and intricate, in a way that kind of darkens the theme overall,
Right.
enabling its return at the very end to sound even more bright and lush and comforting.
Right.
Yeah, it's
I was looking at just some of the other cues, just and I was just trying to get an idea of the orchestration. It seems to be like mostly piano, woodwind strings. There are French horn. I don't know how many, but there are some French horns in it. But you don't hear trumpets, trombones. You don't hear the rest of the
no.
brass. So not
Maybe in just like the end credits version, where the theme is
yeah,
presented in its fullest skies.
yeah,
Um, but it's also a multi-thematic score, which distinguishes it from some of the other smaller scale Williams pieces like Accidental Tourist, which really is a monothematic score. This one
right,
has, I want to say, 3 or 4 main recurring themes. So there's a Sabrina theme, which is that one with the big C drop in the melody, and
right.
then there is another tune called In the Moonlight, which I think, if
Hmm.
anything, is a kind of more interesting harmonically. But what really strikes me about that theme is that Sting performs on the soundtrack.
Right.
This really gorgeous, sort of low key, very jazzy,
Hmm.
with a kind of improvised piano solo in the middle. Not Williams.
Right.
That is extremely sophisticated in his harmonic vocabulary. Does
Hmm.
things that you really don't expect. And then there's another tune, if I can remember, or how can I remember, which is a little bit more
Right.
traditional, and some subsidiary sort of comedic tunes, which may be given, I want to say, to a harpsichord in various places. Williams likes
Right.
adding harpsichord color as a um,
Well, it was a very 60s thing to do.
exactly. It's kind of a light throwback, this kind of quasi baroque styling
Yeah.
that's almost like poking fun at the, I think, the pretty rich characters in this movie, sort of taking them down a slight peg with this
Right.
slightly silly harpsichord music.
Right. One thing I know we could go over a few more cues, but a movie I've not seen in a very long time is the original version of this film, which was
All right.
1954 with Humphrey Bogart and Audrey
Bogart, yeah.
Hepburn. And I'm embarrassed to admit I don't even know who composed the score for the original.
Yeah, I'd have to search my memory for that one too. I think it's someone actually fairly prominent, but
Yeah.
as far as I know, there's no cross references or
Okay.
allusions to that in the
Right.
Williams score.
I did note there's an ostinato in the woodwinds in the cue called Linus's New Life, and I thought that this really reminds me of Home Alone. It's kind of a yada da da da. It has a bit of a tension. Yada
Hmm.
da 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 yada da 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 yada da da da. I think it's a five note. I have to double check, but
Yep.
he makes use of some standards in there, like some other songs like La Vie en Rose.
Oh yeah, there's a beautiful little small scale arrangement that I think starts out on an accordion or some similar instrument, and then gets
Right.
you know in the second phrase really expanded and made more lush. And there's
And
also a wonderful sequence of four jazz standards that I have not been able, and I don't think anyone knows. I've tried to find this out in the past. If it was Williams who actually arranged these pieces, like
yep.
"Call Me Irresponsible" and "Stella by
Shadow of Your
Starlight."
Smile.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
like these
yeah.
great themes that Williams, probably knows like the back of his hand, and they're orchestrated in a way that is not so dissimilar to some of those early jazz albums
Hmm.
that he Williams himself arranged. A lot of it kind of referring back to a certain strain of sort of Claude Thornhill 1930s
Yeah.
lush and sort of soft edged jazz arranging, sort of proto Gil Evans, almost. That's what I hear in the Sabrina soundtrack. So I wouldn't be surprised to know if Williams actually had fun and arranged these four really well known tunes for this. Is It's source music, right? It plays during a
Yes.
party in the
Yes.
movie.
I meant to say earlier, if you're a John Williams fan out there, um, his full name is John Tanner Williams, and there is like the John Tanner sound
Hmm.
that predates any of his film music.
Yeah.
I think it's from like the mid '50s, and
Hmm.
his piano playing is just like astounding.
Yeah, yeah. He is was and to this day remains a very technically impressive piano player.
Yeah.
And one thing that surprises me is that he has not yet written a piano concerto. There are rumors
Wow.
that this is on his agenda to write a piano
Right.
concerto for Emanuel Ax, and it remains to be seen if that comes out, whether there is any kind of nod to his roots as a session player, as a jazz pianist, as an arranger, as someone who
Right.
can improvise with the best of them and do some really novel things, which was the norm in 1950s jazz, was to be rather experimental with rhythm, with harmony, and that was his bread and butter for a while. The
Okay.
John Towner touch, I think, yeah, is
Yep,
one of those albums.
exactly. All right, I can already tell it was a mistake to try to do three scores. We're gonna have to make a part 3 down the
Yeah.
road, and come back because I love film music and I love talking about the nuts and bolts. But let's talk about one that's very different. And this was a revelation to me maybe 2 or 3 years ago when I heard it for the first time, and that's Images, a Robert Altman film from 1972. And I finally 2 nights ago watched it. I had to go to I think it was the Tubi app, and watch it
Uh-huh.
with a few commercials in there, but, um, It's with Susanna York and it's with Renee. I forgot his last name, but I actually know him as the audiobook narrator for some Douglas
Right, and
Preston and Lincoln Child books.
he was in Star Trek Deep Space Nine, I want to say. Yeah,
Yeah.
pretty accomplished character actor.
Um, I'm not willing to say it's the most surreal film I've seen because
Hmm.
like there's some others like Persona and some Ingmar Bergman films and some other things out there, but it's certainly up there. It's among the English language films. It's one of the
Hmm.
most surreal films, and I'm still not sure if anything I saw in the film really happened or if it's entirely in her head.
Right. Well.
Not not to give anything away, but it doesn't involve, a lot of psychological,
Hmm. Well.
things going on. But I would say let's talk about some influences going into this score because I think it helps to understand the style of like Ligeti,
Hmm.
Christoph Penderecki, and maybe even Xenakis. What are some of the compositional styles that you get from
Yeah.
their music?
Well, it's almost certainly Williams' most experimental and avant-garde score, and Altman, from my understanding, was basically gave him free reign. He said, you do whatever you want,
Mhm.
given our budget. Um, the only thing I request is that don't do something that you've already tried before. Really,
Mm,
push your creative boundaries, which is actually not something that Williams gets asked all that much.
right.
I think to our detriment because he can be so strikingly original when the assignment calls for it. And I mean, he you can tell from his concert music around that time, the concerti and
Mhm.
instrumental pieces that he was writing, Essay for Strings, Flute Concerto, some of the jazzy sort of instrumental music that he wrote for the Neophonic Orchestra, that he was very up on musical modernism in the
Right.
1940s, 50s, 60s. For images, I mean, you mentioned a few, Ligeti, Penderecki. I think Varese would be a particularly strong
Yeah.
influence. The use of percussion and the sort of conceptual nature of a lot of the music in that score seems to be directly related to the admittedly small output of Varese. And um, the usage of sort of sound objects. There was a series of sculptures, I think, that
Yes.
inspired Williams in
Right.
conjunction with a Japanese musician, Yamashita, who performed a lot on the soundtrack, vocal and instrumental and percussion and
Right.
wind. Sometimes aleatoric, which is not specifically written out, but actually surprisingly, most of it was very meticulously notated, even the stuff
Right.
that sounds totally spontaneous. And Williams was using at the time all the most advanced notational techniques,
Yeah.
chronometric and aleatoric seeming, non measured notation, but it always still had to align with the film in some way. So there was
Right.
a degree of specificity.
But it does give like the players a little bit more freedom. So it's like approximately this pitch, for example,
Right.
and you can kind of and sometimes you get like rhythmic patterns that they can kind of do a certain number of times or number of
Hmm.
tempo within, certain
Yeah.
time frame. I thought if you were going to listen to a single cue that expresses like the most diverse elements, is the
Hmm.
opening scene, and it's called In Search of Unicorns,
Hmm.
which is while there's a narrative passage and it's showing the house, you get like this really nice, almost typical Williams,
Hmm.
strings, kind of a pulsing bass,
Hmm.
piano theme that does a lot of intervals of sixths and so forth. And
Right, parallel six, and a few little
yeah,
unexpected tonal motions. For the most part, though, is
but
pretty
it gets
conventional.
interrupted jarringly so
Right.
by the by the percussion. It's a Japanese percussionist, Tomo Yamashita.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
And
the
Williams, he collaborated with this
yeah.
person and really, allowed Yamashita to determine the kind of soundscape of this movie as much
Well,
as
I
anyone
noticed what he did on this. It was very enlightening. A friend was able to loan me some sketches that he had a copy of,
else. Okay.
and he writes out the rhythm he wants in the
Hmm.
percussion, but he doesn't say what the instruments are.
Is that right?
Yeah, so I mean, at least that's what I can tell. Now I don't know, those are sketches they might have gotten fleshed out,
Yeah.
before the film, but that's pretty neat. So it seems like Williams knew the effect he wanted, but he let,
Mhm.
Yamashita choose the instruments.
Right. And without that score, it's very hard to place actually some of those instruments. I mean, there's such
Right.
unusual effects atypical techniques used on familiar instruments that it gives it extremely unearthly quality to the whole score, which is of course magnified by its juxtaposition with the somewhat more conventional string and piano writing.
Right.
And
And
that
there's
that does
also
persist across the whole soundtrack to that sort of
yeah.
clash of styles.
There's also some vocal grunts and sometimes even some spoken words and whispered
Mhm.
words. It's kind of almost reminds me of, not a film that wouldn't come out till 5 years later, but Suspiria with the
Yeah, yeah.
goblin score.
But this is all completely acoustic, right? I
Oh,
think
yes.
there's no synthesizers whatsoever in the score,
Right.
which is, I mean, that's generally true for Williams. Sometimes there will be some smaller scale synth components, but uh, uh, certainly not in this one. It's all produced there on the stage,
Right.
and yeah, it's a marvelous score. There's also some components that are on the soundtrack that didn't make it into the final cut of the movie.
Yeah, the
Um,
Blood Moon didn't
Blood
make it, right?
Moon. That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And Blood Moon, this is one of those quasi Baroque styled pieces that, with a
Mhm.
little bit of a 20th century twist in place as well, but densely contrapuntal with canonic writing and even kind of polyphonic juxtaposition of two themes towards the end. Nothing, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, nothing strictly fugal. Right, there are
Yeah.
no actual fugues in that piece or in the score, which is something that Williams has done. He likes
Yeah.
to
Shark
sneak
Cage Fugue.
he likes to sneak them in there when you don't expect it. But
Right.
even so, the style here is still is very sort of 18th century classical, but with a tiny jolt of Prokofiev here and there with the modulations or wrong notes.
Right.
Very impressive compositionally. I'm glad that he got it on the soundtrack album. Um, if it were
Yeah.
cut from the final movie, or maybe it was just something that he wrote that was inspired by it that he never um, envisioned being in the film itself. That was the case for actually quite a number of Williams soundtracks around this time. That like the soundtrack album would be kind of its own text, and Williams would arrange and have all these cues sort of presented in a slightly different manner than they were in the actual movie. That's the
Right.
case with Jaws and E.T. and several others from that time period.
There's a cue, listed on the soundtrack called Reflections. So I was
Mm.
brushing up on just the soundtrack this morning before we had our interview, and I had the door open, and my wife popped in when I was playing that. I was like, "What are you listening to?"
Oh yeah, this is the same guy who wrote the Superman March, right?
I
Those
know,
fan
but
favorites.
it's strings, that are not in tune at the highest, the highest level they can play, and just changing effects, just kind of like you get from like Penderecki and
Yeah.
some others, and very aleatoric, very random. It's parts of it sound like Webern, but parts of it sound like the other composers we've mentioned,
Yeah.
and all Williams. And what are some of the films that you think like this type of writing made it into later? Like I definitely would say Jaws,
Hmm.
parts of the original, like the I don't know so much about Return of the Jedi, but definitely Star Wars and The Empire Strikes Back. I guess I should say A New Hope for those who insist out there. And then, oh gosh, I was trying to think, like Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Hmm.
I
When the evil spirits
and
emerge out of the
this,
ark and
oh
start
yeah,
blowing over people's faces. Yeah, I don't know that there's ever been a score in his output that has been as
right.
consistently avant-garde as Images before or since.
Oh,
But he
almost left
certainly
out Close Encounters of the
Close
Third Kind.
Encounters. Well, that exactly. So,
Yep.
I mean that has its own kind of trajectory from dissonance into
The
blazing
Abduction
with
of Barry,
constant.
I believe, is the
Yeah.
cue that really
Well,
sticks out on that.
that's like every trick of the trade learned from Sonorism and Penderecki and Ligeti and all those pieces is present, um, and marvelously effective, of course. More recently, I mean, I don't know how recent this would be considered at this point, but like War of the Worlds from
Yeah.
2005 is a pretty thoroughly dissonant and aggressive score.
Yeah.
maybe more rhythmic in its aggression than timbral or in terms of pitch, and that you could trace that perhaps back to Stravinsky and the Rite of Spring.
Right.
And more often though, you'll just hear these little pockets or isolated moments of extreme modernistic writing and otherwise more stylistically diverse scores. I mean, that's true for all of the action adventure movies where there's scenes of stress or horror that Williams will fall back on this kind of Eastern European really path-breaking 20th century composers for his stylistic adventures. AI is another really impressive one that I mean, another kind of library of modernist techniques, plus an extremely sentimental and gorgeous kind of tonal lyricism. Both of those things are juxtaposed.
Right. I'm not going to insult The Empire Strikes Back by trying to get a discussion in just a couple of minutes. So, definitely, I think we'll have a Star Wars episode. We'll feature that score. But I'm going to make a statement right now, and I would love for you to tell me why you agree or why you disagree. And that is, I think that The Empire Strikes Back, that specific score, is not only John Williams' greatest, most complete score, but I think it's the greatest film score of all time.
I'm supposed to be a little bit guarded, as an academic, I should make it big, bold, objective sounding. But yeah, I think I probably agree. I really do. It's almost irresistible. Every time you study the score, you find something absolutely like just mind blowing. I was talking with another film music analyst the other day, and they were discovering all kinds of like 12-tone rows and buried Easter eggs of compositional mastery in there. But the quality of the big three new themes in that one, Imperial March, Yoda and Han Solo and the Princess, and
they all improve
I mean, it's just it's a magnificent score from start to finish. There are no dead spots, not a single one. There is compositional interest and dramatic interest at every moment. There's a really amazingly controlled arc to the score, where themes are tentatively introduced and then are explored and then get this sort of blazing culmination at certain points. And it ends with a bang. Like the Carbon Freeze onwards is just wall-to-wall amazing scoring, just like the Battle of Hoth is like, from that point to the end of the asteroid fields, like that's the single most impressive action sequence scoring in all of Hollywood history.
If we were maybe we'll save this more for like Star Wars, but like, he does some interesting techniques that make it sound familiar, but not quite like, the what's known as the rebel fanfare is often played in like, some of the battle scenes from A New Hope. It's entirely harmonized with major triads. Is one of the things I noticed, which, that's not very common, out there. You usually get a mix. And then like the arc theme, is all minor triads for the most part.
Yeah, no, he loves this sort of planing or thick parallel voice leading for harmonies, which in the case of the Rebel Fanfare gives it a very bright but slightly, there's almost a sourness to it, because every interval is chromatic. None of the chords actually exist within the same key as each other. The sort of intensified major chromaticism is a very cool effect. And it's a very Star Wars effect too, particularly when it's the brass that are doing it and the trumpets. It doesn't necessarily have to be the Rebel Fanfare. I mean, there are other moments where it's not, thematic or motivic, but are still using major triads and chromatic relationships for these exciting, generally space battle type scenes.
Well, this is a teaser for conversation down the road. There's so much you want to. I mean, I think as I thought about it, Empire Strikes Back needs its own episode, but we can refer to other Star Wars from it. So, just a few kind of I don't know, rapid fire questions here, real quick. What do you predict for so we're recording this in late January. What do you predict for the Oscar for Best Original Score? Do you think John Williams is going to get it again?
Well, he's certainly been nominated enough times. But if you go with the statistics there, he's more likely to lose than he is to win.
But there's a lot of politicking, and
there's a lot of politicking, and it has. I mean, generally speaking, it doesn't necessarily reflected the quality or importance of the score. In the case of the Fabelmans, I mean, I think it's a wonderful score. Certainly, no one could have done it better. It's, gorgeous
Right.
themes and really subtle. That is a chamber score if there ever were one.
Right.
It's also quite slight. There isn't actually that much music there.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't be surprised if it goes to something a little bit more extroverted
Yeah.
and maybe trendy, like the Hurwitz score for Babylon. But I don't know. I generally try not to predict, because when I have done that, it's usually been, oh, surely they'll just give it to the Williams. It's so self-evidently better and more, impressively crafted and compositionally like masterful than all the other things. And then it invariably doesn't go to Williams. So like I give up. I don't know.
Well, I'm gonna steer listeners to just a couple of places to check out more about you. So you have a book, and I confess I haven't read it, but it's going to be on my list. Is Hollywood Harmony: Musical Wonder and the Sound of Cinema. It's by Oxford Music, and you can find it on Amazon. And I see there's a Kindle edition, so I'll probably be adding that to my library soon. And I'd like to steer listeners to your website, franklehman.com. So it's FrankLehman.com. Yeah, I mean, we started talking about Star Wars. So before or after our next talk, when we get into Empire Strikes Back, you have on your list a complete catalog of musical themes from Star Wars, and this is just amazing work. I was just I think there's probably weeks worth of reading and digesting,
Yeah, and I have to make a confession. It's about to get a whole lot bigger too. I have
Oh,
a
nice.
big update in the works. I mean, it takes a very long time, surprisingly, a large amount of time to sometimes, make even the smallest changes to this thing. But
you have a number of peer-reviewed papers, just some fascinating reading that people can go click on. Is there anything else that you'd like to share where people can find you or follow what you're doing?
I think that the website's probably the best bet, and see where that leads you.
Yeah, I know you were on Twitter, but like so many in 2022 have said that they need at least a break from that.
I cut the cord, yeah, and my stress level has gone so far down since then.
Right. Are you elsewhere on social media?
I'm on Facebook, so
Okay.
just look me up on Facebook, and that's an easy way to connect with me. I don't post very sophisticated things on that page, but
okay. Well, we're gonna put a ribbon on this. Frank, I almost wish we had 2 hours to talk, but thank you so much for taking time and just a little introduction to John Williams, and just wishing him a happy 91st birthday, and just thank you for the wealth of film scores that he's brought to generations of film goers.
It's a bottomless gift. Man just keeps on giving. It's amazing. Well, thank you very much for having me on. This was fun, and we should definitely, follow up, because there is so much to talk about, clearly.
Excellent. Well, thank you. And I wish it wasn't true, but that is the end of episode number 8. That is all of that interview. But I can assure you there will be a part 2, and I'm looking very forward to that. And thank you so much. And just a reminder, what's your favorite John Williams score? It doesn't have to be any of the ones we mentioned, or if you have a specific theme. I would love it if you would tell me with your own voice at speakpipe.com. It's speakpipe.com/musician toolkit. And by the way, we have a website in progress. It's through my main website. You want to go to davidlanemusic.com/toolkit. And you can find the podcast feed, all of the episodes. You can also contact me through that if you don't want to leave a voice message. You just want to leave me a regular message. And also, if there's any other feedback you'd like to leave on the show, and I would also remind you, please, thank you for the ratings that we've received so far. If you enjoy the show, please give it a 5-star rating and review. And if you enjoy this episode, please share it with somebody who would enjoy it. Either another musician or just a film music fan. Again, thank you for listening, and I will be back with you next Monday with episode 9.